Hello, I'm Louise Louu. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics this week. Donald Trump's tariff policy is taking shape. The president is already touting benefits to the US economy. But is he really winning the trade war? And at what cost to the American people? Tariffs are threatening Asia's manufacturing hubs. US tech giants that rely on components from the region are under pressure too. But who stands to lose more from the punitive measures? The number of hungry people is falling globally, but the crisis is deepening in Africa and the Middle East. So what is affecting food security in many nations? And can hunger ever be eradicated? Donald Trump aims to rebalance the global trading system, which he says is tilted against America. To achieve that, the president has announced a new round of tariffs, again, on just about every country in the world. His supporters are already hailing his policy as a success, and it seems Trump's trade experiment is paying off better than most had expected. At least for now. He's got his biggest trading partners to make deals that are closer to his demands than theirs. Financial markets have shrugged off higher duties and tariff revenues are pouring in. But economists say Americans will pay more for many goods they consume when the tariffs take effect. So is Trump really winning the trade war? Or is it a short-term victory with long-term risks? Ume Kulsum Sharif reports.
The US president's plan for a new global trading system took effect on August 7th. Donald Trump has managed to bend many trading partners to agree to his latest tariffs not seen in a century. The UK, EU and Japan struck deals ahead of the deadline, while others say they're still negotiating. Canada and South Africa, facing 35% and 30% import taxes respectively, have criticized Trump's decision and are pushing for a resolution.
We will come to something with the Americans, something constructive with the Americans.
Brazil and India are being punished with 50% tariffs. The import taxes on Brazil are in response to what Trump calls a witch hunt against former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. Trump's far-right ally is on trial for allegedly plotting a coup. And India faces the punitive measures for buying Russian oil and making big profits from selling it on. Lesotho's 50% rates have been slashed to 15%, but the damage seems to have already been done. The initial tariffs in April led to widespread order cancellations, factory closures and job losses.
I now have a big problem because the money that I was making is gone. It's now month end and I'm just here at home and there is no income coming in.
But he's offered relief to Southeast Asian nations like Indonesia and Thailand and Cambodia, who've agreed on a ceasefire after a 5-day border conflict.
The 32% to 19% tariff drop is much better. This gives some breathing room to the manufacturers of these products, while we eye opportunities to not rely on the US market.
While it's still unclear what the final tariffs between the US and China will look like, Trump says the world's two largest economies are close to a deal. Their tit-for-tat levies in the past few months have rattled global markets. Trump says he's winning the trade war. American consumers say they're losing. As US tariff revenues rise, the costs are hitting domestic firms and buyers.
Every time I come, it's more money, more price, more rising prices. It's terrible. I can't believe this.
Trump's tariff regime faces a legal threat, with some questioning his authority to impose them under emergency measures. The president says import taxes will push US consumers to buy more American-made goods. But his trade war with the world is serving as a wake-up call to nations to look for new markets and fresh alliances. Kulsum Sharif, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
While Trump may have achieved a political victory, the economic success of his policies remains debatable. Let's have a look at what the data says then. The Bureau of Labour Statistics has recently said the economy added only 73,000 jobs last month, far below expectations. They were also sharply down in May and June. That has prompted Trump to fire the head of the agency, saying the data was rigged. The economy has expanded at an annual rate of 3%, but it grew much slower in the first half of this year than in the previous 2 years. Inflation has ticked up from 2.4% in May to 2.7% in June. However, the Treasury Department reports around $150 billion in tariff revenue since Trump took office. But the budget lab at Yale University says the average cost of Trump's tariffs to the American household would be $2,400 this year. Ian Goldin is a professor of globalization and development at the Oxford University, and he joins us from there now. Ian, we're having this conversation on Thursday, August the 7th, which is when most of Trump's tariffs took effect. Bearing in mind anything could happen between now and when people watch our show, has Donald Trump won the trade war?
I think he's certainly managed to get trading partners to bend. There's a very aggressive tariffs on many, many countries, and we're seeing the line of leaders going to Washington. But I don't think this is going to be a long-term win. I think it's going to be bad for U.S. consumers, particularly for the people that voted for President Trump, the poorer people in the U.S., the people in the Midwest and elsewhere who voted for him. It's going to be bad, I think, for U.S. businesses because their profits are going to slow as the economy slows. And of course, it's bad for international alliances because amongst the countries he's penalizing are his closest allies, like Europe, like Canada, and like Taiwan. So it's, I think, going to prove very, very difficult in the medium term to sustain this.
OK, bearing that in mind, to be fair on Donald Trump for a moment, more than 900 eminent economists, including Nobel laureates, have slammed his economic policies as economically unsound. But the financial markets haven't collapsed this time round, unlike in April.
Yes, financial markets have been very resilient. It's partly, I think, because of the uncertainties and the idea among some people that he will reduce the tariffs over time. I think it's partly because the tech stocks are dominating the markets so heavily. They account for a very significant share of the markets, and they've been doing very well. And it's partly, I think, because of the diversification away. The rest of the world economy is doing relatively well. Oil prices haven't gone up, and consumer spending is quite robust in Asia and elsewhere. So I think markets in general are doing well. But you're right, they haven't penalized President Trump. And I think there's also a bet that interest rates will come down slowly. And that, I think, will also please the markets.
OK, but the White House did promise 90 deals in 90 days. Now, that didn't happen. So what countries are the big winners and losers here?
I don't think any countries are winners. I think in these trade conflicts, everyone loses out. US will lose out, and all the trade partners will lose out. So I think that if there's one country that might be a winner out of this, it's going to be China, because it's proved itself to be a more reliable trading partner with many countries. The tariffs have not yet hit hard on China. And of course, it stands to gain the most from diversification to the rest of Asia and the rest of the world. So I think there's no winners in this.
From Tokyo to the EU, nations have made concessions. So has Trump succeeded in using America's economy as leverage and tariffs as a powerful bargaining tool?
He's certainly politicized tariffs very heavily. We've seen him in recent days, for example, threatening India with a doubling of tariffs unless they reduce their imports of or end their imports of Russian oil. We've seen the attacks on Brazil related to President Bolsonaro. We've seen the one of the reasons given for the increase in tariffs on Canada is that Canada is supporting the idea of a two-state solution, a recognition of Palestinian state. So we've seen the use of tariffs for political purposes. So far, I haven't seen that leading countries to back off from their political positions. In fact, it strengthened the position of President Lula in Brazil, I think, politically. But it is certainly being used in all different ways. Part of the Mexico and Canada discussion is around drug and smuggling of fentanyl into the US. So we're seeing this used very widely. But my feeling is that this is not going to be sustained and that we're going to see much more a return to lower tariffs as the real cost to US consumers hits hard over the coming years, which I believe it certainly will. The tariff increase has also led to some gains for the US in terms of customs, so over $100 billion, and that's rising. So that's a plus for President Trump, but it's at the cost of a slower economy. And while the income is very rapid, the cost is going to take longer to be manifest.
OK, let's talk about the consumer worldwide then. Huge brands like Nike, Adidas, they've already said that they're putting up their prices. Will the consumer ultimately pay the price? And what does this mean for the global economy?
Yes, consumers will pay the price. In the US. Around the rest of the world, I don't think the impact will be negative. And the reason is that the rest of the world is not increasing tariffs. So globalization and trade is alive and well. It's thriving in Asia. It's doing well elsewhere. And in fact, prices might come down elsewhere as some of the trade is diverted from the US to other places. So I think consumers elsewhere are unlikely to be directly affected, except in export industries. So workers who work in export industries that sell to the US will be negatively affected, but they are a tiny share of global consumers. And so I don't see global consumption being negatively affected by this.
We will watch closely what happens. Ian Golden, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now let's zoom into the potential impact of Trump's tariffs once they take effect. Manufacturing has powered the economies of many Southeast Asian nations as companies shifted away from China. US tech giants have relied heavily on factories in the region to assemble devices and sourced many components from nations there. But many of those countries, once seen as safe bets, are now facing higher tariffs. That will likely hurt Asian economies that rely on exports. But American firms are also bearing the brunt. Apple, for example, earns around half of its revenue by selling iPhones that are manufactured in China, Vietnam and India. It says tariffs have already cost the firm $800 million in the previous quarter and may add more than $1 billion in costs to the next quarter. The company says it's investing another $100 billion to expand its operations in the US. Companies have rerouted their goods bound for the US through Southeast Asian nations to minimize their exposure to US tariffs after Trump's first trade war with Beijing. That has become known as the China +1 strategy. But this time, these transshipped goods are also being targeted. To discuss the impact further, we are joined now by Louise Louu, who is Head of Asia Economics at Oxford Economics, and she joins us now from Singapore. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme. So the details are slowly emerging, aren't they? But what is the impact of Trump's tariffs in Asia so far?
So far, we haven't seen much damage being done yet, but we think that that's because people are anxious and people are buying products now in anticipation that these prices might go up later. So we should see demand fall off quite rapidly in the coming months, even though right now the data looks pretty solid in terms of exports, in terms of production across Asia.
Apple have just announced a fresh $100 billion of investment in their US domestic manufacturing. Now, that is a pledge to make more iPhones and components domestically in America. So is this showing that Donald Trump's policy of putting America first is working? And will this be harmful to Asian economies?
I think it's really sector specific. So for the high-end electronics manufacturing sector, where these sectors could benefit from R&D spending, from a lot of the high-end infrastructure that the US already has, we think that that's possible. But for the other industries, which are perhaps a little bit more lower value adding and that demand a lot more on that are more sensitive to cost pressures, we think that reshoring operations or production facilities back in the US might not be that feasible. So I think it's very hard to say that President Trump has really succeeded in this manufacturing renaissance in the US. I think it's very sector specific.
Let's focus, Louise, on semiconductors now. Now, these are tiny chips used in smartphones, laptops, remote car keys, for example. Now, more than half the world's chips come from Taiwan. So now, could this hinder the US's efforts to gain a technological lead over China, for example?
Well, I think so far, when we think about US-China tech war, the one source of vulnerability that China has is in semiconductors. And this is where I think the three-way relationship between China, between Taiwan, and the US really demands a bit closer monitoring. We've seen Taiwanese companies, semiconductor companies like TSMC set up factories in the US that would help, that kind of knowledge transfer between Taiwan, between the US, that would help, the US cement its technological lead over China. And we think that in the longer term, what that means is that for Chinese authorities, they're likely to double down on their efforts to really build a domestic supply chain for semiconductors, especially on the high end. And it really depends on how things play out. When it comes to the technological race, the goalpost is always shifting forward. The technological frontier is always shifting forward. And so, I think that would instigate a lot more government money to pour forth into these industries in China. And I think that would probably narrow the gap between US and China over the longer term.
Now, firms have been forced to reroute their goods bound for the US through Vietnam and Thailand, for example. So they are now, these transshipped goods are also being targeted by Trump's tariffs. So how can these companies get around these levies now?
We think that, essentially what's happening is, the penalties that we are seeing the Trump administration imposed on these transshipments is going to incentivize firms to be more creative about going to alternative supply routes. So that could mean, in speaking to market participants, that could mean a product being disassembled and being shipped out in different packages. So you can think about maybe a shoe being shipped out with its shoelaces in a different package. We should see more efforts at perhaps underreporting the value of their goods to evade tariffs, the quantum of tariffs they have to pay. We could see more markets coming into play as possible destinations for rerouting. I think what's going to happen with these slightly ambiguous terms that we see in trade deals is that Chinese manufacturers in particular is going to be a lot more creative about skirting around some of the more traditional markets. So, beyond Vietnam, beyond Mexico, what are the other markets that, the Chinese manufacturers could ship their goods through?
Okay, Louise Louu, we really thank you for your time. Thank you. More than 2.3 billion people experience moderate or severe food insecurity globally. But a new report by the UN says there has been progress in fighting hunger, particularly in Latin America and Southern Asia. The number of hungry people around the world fell for a third straight year in 2024, down from a COVID-era spike. More than 673 million people, or 8.2% of the world's population, experienced hunger last year, slightly lower than in 2023. Africa is bucking that trend, though. According to the State of Food Security and Nutrition report, 1 out of 5 people on the African continent, or 307 million people, faced hunger last year. The UN says that nearly 1 billion people in Africa were unable to afford a healthy diet in 2023. Projections indicate by 2030, nearly 60% of the world's chronically undernourished population will be in the continent. In the Middle East, 1 in 7, or 66 million people, experience chronic hunger. The World Food Programme says it needs an additional $5.7 billion to fund projects to feed people. But global funding cuts are obstructing efforts. The US has suspended more than $2 billion in aid under new Trump policies. UN agencies say the report focused on chronic, long-term problems and did not reflect the impact of crises brought on by specific events and wars, including Sudan and Israel's war on Gaza. The humanitarian situation in the Palestinian Strip has reached catastrophic levels, with the United Nations saying there is now famine across most of Gaza. And the hunger crisis is worsening by the day in the capital of Sudan's North Darfur region, Al-Fasher, where the paramilitary rapid support forces have been blocking food or fuel from entering the city. Narges Mobadari reports.
Across Gaza, children are starving to death. But this is a man-made hunger. The UN and a series of humanitarian groups have repeatedly accused Israel of starving Palestinians, calling it genocide and a weapon of war. UN figures say at least 180 people have died of hunger so far. It's not just children. Currently, the entire population of more than 2 million people are facing severe food shortages due to Israel's blockade of aid and food. 500,000 people in Gaza are in a catastrophic state of hunger, acute malnutrition and illness.
We never get our fair share of the aid. My husband is paralyzed, and there are widows and women like me who can't secure food for their children. Some young men take the aid and sell it at a high price.
Hundreds more Palestinians have died trying to get food from the notorious Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The Israel and US-run organization has taken over food distribution, with chaotic results. The UN says 859 people were killed near the group's sites from May 27th to July 31st this year. Hundreds of others have been killed along the routes of UN-led food convoys.
I go for aid and risk my life to bring flour for my mother and siblings. I also collect cardboard. Some people push me when I ask for a kilo of flour.
In northeast Africa, conflict has created the world's largest humanitarian crisis in Sudan.
But the scale of this need is just staggering, and along with our partners, we're being stretched to the limit. Sadly, this is true across the country. With the situation deteriorating rapidly, children are dying from hunger, they're dying from disease, and they're dying from direct violence.
The UN's World Food Programme reports nearly 25 million Sudanese, half the population, are facing extreme hunger, with famine confirmed in multiple areas. A civil war between Sudan's army and the paramilitary rapid support forces over the past 2 years has left hundreds of thousands dead from hunger and disease. These conflicts and others show no sign of resolution, leaving the people starving and suffering. Narges Mobadari, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Joining us now is Maximo Torrero, who is the chief economist of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, one of the groups that authored this report. And he joins us now from Rome. We appreciate your time, Maximo. So, Maximo, I just want to ask you about Africa. In theory, Africa should be able to feed its people. What is going wrong there?
Yeah, so normally what we do in the SOFI report is to project ceteris paribus, so meaning keeping the same conditions, what will be the number in 2030. And that number for the world will be 512 million people in hunger, of which 60% will be Africa, which will be surpassing the number of Asia, of course. Now, of course, Africa can create a transformation and can do a change. We observe today a few countries in Africa which are slightly improving, but our hope is that this will change substantially. Why we expect this to happen and why we think this is possible, because Africa has an enormous potential to grow in productivity of food. Basically, Africa is an organic continent, a lot of space to increase productivity, to increase diversity of diets. And at the same time, there is a lot of lessons learned coming from Latin America and from Asia that Africa can learn. And those apply specifically to the most vulnerable people in the distribution. We're talking about social protection programs. We have seen what South America have learned about it and how Africa can learn on it. Also school feeding programs, but also digitalization of beneficiaries like what is happening in India, which have helped to improve targeting and improve acceleration to protect the most vulnerable populations.
And Maximo, let me talk to you about cuts in aid. Donald Trump and other Western countries have cut their aid budgets. Is there a growing sense from economic powers in the world that these countries should be able to sort out their own hunger problems?
Look, what we observe in the world right now, especially if we look at the G7 countries, even the G20 countries, the support of ODA and aid has been going down. This historical, it has gone down to historical levels. It's not only one country, it's several G7 countries which are in the next and following years going to cut down. And yes, that is a complexity, especially for Africa, where there has been a significant reduction in foreign aid. And this will affect not only the agri-food system, but the whole system itself, because it will affect also health, it will affect education, it will affect transboundary diseases. So yes, is on the other hand, an opportunity for these countries to start to implement what they have. If you go to the continent of Africa, it's one of the few continents that have already a strategy, which is the CARP Renew strategy, which clearly has outcomes and indicators that they need to improve performance. We have space in increased efficiency in public expenditures in Africa, but we also have enormous space to attract investment from development banks, international financial organizations, but also from the private sector. So I think there is a moment now to take this as a challenge, but also as an opportunity to be able to accelerate how these countries can start a transformation of the agri-food system so that we can change this negative trend and now start to reduce hunger, like what we are observing happening in South America, especially, and also in other parts of the world, like India. So a lot of space to improve and a lot of space to accelerate this process, because clearly ODA and aid will be shrinking, and that implies that we need to increase innovative ways of financing. We need to increase capacity of countries to improve and be more efficient in the resources they have, and to find a sustainable way out of the situation they are facing today.
OK, taking that into account, though, we've been speaking on this programme about US President Donald Trump's tariffs. Are those going to make it harder for this situation and for countries that are struggling to feed its people?
Look, the issue of the tariffs, which are not only related to the US, because we need to understand that the fact of the tariffs will be affecting, of course, other parts of the world, because it will depend, of course, on the response. So right now, we know the only thing that we can say is at the global level, of course, the situation of tariffs will be impacting all the countries of the world. But it is difficult to directly attribute specific tariff decisions to rising food prices, given the current uncertainties and differing short, medium, and long-term effects, depending on country responses. The broader use of protectionist trade policies undermines the international cooperation and predictability essential for well functioning of the agri-food systems. So trade restrictions and market uncertainty, such that those introduced by tariffs, are among the structural drivers behind the recent reversal of progress. So we need to wait and see, because it not only depends on what country does, it depends on the reaction of the other countries, and it will depend also on the time frame, because the effects will be different in the short, medium, and long-term effects. Again, what this will bring at the global level, of course, is loss of efficiency, but it will also bring potential segmentation of what we call the spaghetti ball of trade, because now there will be different segments of the world trading between them, and that's something that we will need to see in the future, how this will evolve and what will happen as a result of this.
OK, Maximo Torrero, thank you for your time.
A pleasure.
That is our show for this week. Do get in touch with us on X. I'm at Louise Pilbeam TV. And use the hashtag AJCTC when you do that. Or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC, and that will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for our edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Louise Pilbeam from the whole team. Thank you for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is up next.